My professional life had trained me to view emotional events as contracts. You offered a promise, you accepted the terms, and the resulting feeling was the inevitable execution of the agreement. That night, standing on the smooth granite of my own driveway, the one I was still paying for, the one I had let Madison and Julian use for this absurd engagement party planning meeting, the contract was voided, instantaneously and without appeal. Julian's hand was warm at my waist, a silent, anchoring weight. My sister, Madison, and her oldest friend, Chloe, were positioned on the porch, a tableau of expensive, careless entitlement. Their laughter was not a sound I was unfamiliar with. It was the easy, brittle sound of women who believed their style was their only true currency, a sound I had often been the quiet, financial foundation for. Julian and I had just driven up. I was in my car, a 7-year-old Audi Q5. It was meticulously maintained, paid for in cash, and entirely unremarkable. As an attorney who dealt in complex, multi-million-dollar deals, the car was a deliberate choice, invisible, reliable, zero debt. Is that still the Audi? Chloe asked, not even bothering to disguise the slight, rising inflection of disbelief. Her tone implied the car was a contagious rash. Madison immediately adopted the familiar, practiced sisterly cringe. "Oh, Chloe, don't. You know M's responsible," she said, stressing the word like it was a terminal diagnosis. "She needs a car that gets her to work, not one that makes a statement." They both laughed again. It was low, shared, and entirely without malice, which somehow made it worse. It was the laughter of people who genuinely believed my restraint was born of necessity, not choice. I felt the familiar, dull throb of the old wound, the boring older sister, the one who always had the money but never the style. For years, I had tolerated it. I had paid the rent, co-signed the loans, and absorbed the subtle insults, mistaking their dependency for genuine connection. My face remained smooth. I was an expert at professional neutrality. My eyes, however, were not neutral. They tracked the trajectory of Madison's glance, a swift, greedy sweep over my simple cut silk dress, then over Julian. She had always found Julian to be a perplexing contradiction, clearly successful, yet entirely unflashy. He was not a predictable statement piece. Julian, to his credit, heard the laugh, registered the insult, and only tightened his grip on my waist. He knew, better than anyone, what I was quietly capable of. He also knew my history with my sister. He was waiting for my move, but I had none left. My well of tolerance had run dry, but I had no desire to argue. Argument only gave their superficiality oxygen. I stared past them, toward the vast, manicured property adjacent to mine. The mansion next door. It was a recent addition to the neighborhood, a sprawling, glass and steel contemporary structure that had taken over 2 years to build. It was ostentatious, aggressively private, and a common subject of local neighborhood gossip. "Well," Chloe said, still smiling, taking a slow, dramatic sip of her champagne, clearly waiting for me to apologize for my sensible vehicle. "I guess not everyone can justify a Tesla Model X just for running errands." That was her car. Leased, of course. The moment was frozen. The air was cool, the porch light was bright, and the laughter was an echo. This was it, the final, definitive expression of their contempt, delivered with the polite venom of supposed sisterhood and friendship. I opened my mouth to say something neutrally noncommittal, something that would bury the insult without acknowledging it, but Julian spoke first. His voice was low, effortless, and cut through the evening air like high-grade steel. He did not look at Chloe. He looked directly at Madison, his expression entirely devoid of emotion, merely observational. "Speaking of vehicles," Julian said, his eyes drifting slowly from the old Audi to the colossal new mansion next door. "Madison, I was meaning to ask. We heard the owner of that new place finally moved in. Do you happen to know who bought it? I'm curious if they're going to be adding to the HOA or not." He paused, a tiny, almost imperceptible lift of his brow. "Because," Julian continued, his gaze drifting back to my unremarkable Audi Q5, "Emery and I need to figure out which of our 2 cars we're going to register at that address." The porch went silent. The laughter died, instantly, violently. Chloe's champagne flute stopped halfway to her mouth. Madison's practiced smile shattered. The look on Madison's face, that sudden, dawning, sickening realization of who I truly was, who Julian was, and what the innocuous little Audi represented, was the only revenge I would ever need. I said nothing. I only met my sister's eyes. The consequence, not the complaint, had been delivered. My silence was absolute power. The silence that followed Julian's factual statement, the one about which address we'd be registering the cars at, was a physical entity. It didn't just fill the space, it compressed the air in Madison and Chloe's lungs. It was the moment they realized they hadn't been mocking a poor older sister, they had been mocking the quiet owner of the estate they had been collectively coveting and gossiping about for 2 years. I felt Julian's hand relax from my waist, a subtle cue that the play was over. He walked past them and up the front steps, leaving me on the gravel. He didn't gloat. He simply moved into the house I had let them borrow for the evening's charade. Consequence doesn't require performance. Madison's face was the canvas of her entire, desperate life, cycling through disbelief, horror, and then, the reflexive flicker of manipulation. Her eyes darted from me to the mansion next door, then back to my placid face. "Emery. The mansion?" she whispered. She spoke the word with the reverence of a desperate woman suddenly seeing her lottery ticket ripped to shreds. "We closed on the sale 3 months ago," I confirmed, my voice as level as a freshly drawn property line. "We moved our primary residence papers over last week." Chloe, white-faced, managed to stammer, "But the Audi. The old Q5. It gets me to the office," I replied. "It has low mileage and zero maintenance issues. I paid cash. Why replace it?" That was the foundation of our entire relationship, distilled into one boring, financial fact. I had always operated on logic, foresight, and quiet, absolute control. Madison had operated on image, projection, and the belief that my control was an open resource for her to exploit. The truth was, I had needed her approval, or at least the illusion of it, for decades. We were 2 years apart, but Madison had been the radiant one, the social sun. Our parents, kind but emotionally unintelligent, had unconsciously encouraged this imbalance. Emery, the rock; Madison, the rose. I was praised for my high grades and scholarships, she was adored for her effortless charm and ability to navigate social circles. My achievements were practical and expected, her fleeting successes were treated like miracles. When I entered corporate law and began drawing an income that dwarfed our family's entire annual earnings, the dynamic solidified. I became the safety net and the bank. It started subtly. A small loan for rent that was never repaid. A sudden need for a new car when her old one was just too embarrassing to drive to networking events. Advice from Madison on how I should dress or act, always couched as concern, always designed to keep me in my role as the boring, competent foil to her dazzling self. "You know, you should really loosen up. Lawyers are so stiff," she'd say, accepting a $2,000 gift for her birthday that same week. The control was emotional. She wasn't just taking my money, she was suppressing my emotional intelligence and self-worth. By continually casting me as the stable, unstylish older sister, she ensured 2 things. First, that I would always feel subtly obligated to prove I wasn't just boring by financially supporting her, and second, that she would always maintain social superiority. The biggest blind spot in her plan was Julian. When I met Julian 2 years ago, I didn't tell her about his background. I simply introduced him as a friend from the tech industry. Julian was quiet, thoughtful, and saw through Madison's veneer instantly. But he was also fiercely protective of my autonomy. He never told me to cut her off, he simply observed and waited for me to reach my own saturation point. "You don't have to keep doing this, he'd commented once, watching me write a check for Madison's influencer branding course. "It's easier than the fight," I'd admitted. "The guilt is a sharper weapon than the money." The final piece of this rotting foundation was the planning meeting tonight. Madison had insisted on hosting it at my smaller house, the one that wasn't the mansion, supposedly because she was helping me decorate. In reality, it was a subtle display of her ability to dictate my social schedule and a chance for Chloe to observe and report back on how unassuming my life was. The entire interaction about the Q5, the snickering, and the responsible comment, wasn't spontaneous, it was a planned, small-scale performance of their dominance. But they had overplayed their hand. They had taken the final dig, believing my silence meant surrender. They hadn't realized that for the past 6 months, my silence had been the controlled, focused sound of a door being bolted shut, from the inside. I walked past Chloe, who now looked physically ill, her face pale beneath her expensive makeup. I stopped directly in front of Madison. She was still frozen, looking like a statue of sudden, unearned poverty. "The car," I reiterated softly, my eyes locking onto hers. "It works. Just like my life. Unlike yours, it's not an advertisement. It's real. And this," I gestured toward my current, modest home, the one I had worked 15 years to pay for, "was the last thing you were entitled to use. Consider the terms of the arrangement void." I did not wait for a response. I walked into the house, leaving Madison on the porch with the wreckage of her social standing and the immediate, terrifying knowledge that she had just insulted the one person who had been ensuring she wouldn't fail. My heart was beating a cold, steady rhythm. The contract was terminated. The only path left was consequence. The shift began the day I stopped listening to Madison's words and started analyzing her behavior like I would a hostile deposition witness. It wasn't a dramatic awakening, it was a slow, intellectual convergence, primarily catalyzed by Julian's calm presence. Julian didn't tell me Madison was toxic, he merely provided a point of comparison, a relationship based on mutual respect versus one built on perpetual emotional debt. Before Julian, I accepted the narrative that I was financially competent but socially deficient. After Julian, I recognized that Madison's insults were not accurate assessments of my character, but control mechanisms. They were designed to ensure I remained insecure enough to keep funding her lifestyle brand, her apartment, and her revolving door of emergency loans, while simultaneously staying quiet enough not to challenge her self-appointed social queen status. The escalation in the past year had been relentless. The loans had stopped being requests and had become demands. I pulled up the transaction history in my mind, a cold, precise ledger of betrayal. There was the $15,000 for her influencer branding pivot, which she had pitched with spreadsheets and a deck that was remarkably professional, considering the product was essentially photos of herself drinking expensive coffee. "It's seed capital, she'd insisted, her voice tight with entitlement. "I'm taking this seriously. I even have an external investor interested, but I need to show I have skin in the game first." I wired the money. Then, out of professional habit, I asked for the name of the external investor. Madison grew flustered, an amateur's reaction. She deflected, citing NDAs and vague industry secrecy. I didn't press. I cross-referenced the few names she dropped against SEC filings and local business registrations. Unsurprisingly, the investor was fictional. The $15,000 wasn't seed capital, it was the down payment on a luxury trip to the Amalfi Coast she posted about 3 weeks later, captioned, "Manifesting Abundance." This was the critical pivot point. I stopped correcting her lies and started documenting them. It was a shift from sisterly frustration to forensic investigation. I wasn't angry, I was detached, feeling only the cold precision of a lawyer building an airtight case. Simultaneously, the social undermining grew sharper. Madison had realized Julian was serious, that he wasn't just a fling but a fixture in my life. She couldn't diminish him easily, so she tried to define him within her own narrow, superficial terms. "Julian's nice, truly, but he's so reserved," she told me one afternoon, while I was helping her choose a shade of white for her newly acquired, via my money, apartment walls. "He needs more flash. You guys are going to look like my quiet, boring banker parents at parties if you don't step it up." Julian found this hilarious. He had quietly sold his minority stake in his tech firm for an 8-figure sum 6 months earlier. His lack of flash was not an accident, it was a preference. Madison, driven by the desperation for status, couldn't comprehend that real power often moves in silence. The purchase of the mansion next door, the behemoth of glass and steel, was, ironically, about stability, not revenge. Julian and I needed a compound where we could both work remotely and host his small, intense business retreats. When the property came up in a quiet off-market listing, Julian, as the lead negotiator, secured it. We had a choice: move to a different state, or move 200 yards. We chose proximity because the location was perfect for his work, and, more darkly, I knew Madison's aspiration to move into a neighborhood like that was a core motivator for her entire lifestyle performance. Buying the house next door was a strategic move that placed my life directly in the path of her most deeply held, and soon to be shattered, delusion. We kept the purchase utterly private. Only the title attorneys and Julian's family knew. Madison and Chloe only knew that the mansion was the subject of endless speculation, the perfect, unattainable backdrop for their aspirational posts. Madison, convinced she was still the one in control, organized the engagement party planning meeting at my smaller, perfectly respectable, fully paid off house. This event was not about planning, it was about performance. She invited Chloe specifically to validate the scene. The script, as I now saw it, was simple. Acknowledge engagement, maintain the facade of loving sisterhood. Establish superiority, critique my clothes, my house, subtly, and my life choices. The grand finale, mock the car, the symbol of my boring competence, to secure the final, emotional humiliation and reaffirm that despite my money, she, Madison, still held the social and emotional keys to our relationship. I saw it all unfolding in slow motion, the eager, predatory look in Chloe's eyes as she waited to deliver her practice line, Madison's performance of sympathetic disdain. I pulled the Audi Q5 into my driveway that evening, Julian at my side. He asked, just before we stepped out, "Are you going to tell them about the house, Em?" I paused, looking at the familiar porch where my sister waited, poised to strike her final, petty blow. "No," I said, my voice cold and steady. "They want a performance, Julian. I'll give them one. But the stage is set for the inevitable, and I want them to commit to the plot point before the final reveal. The greatest revenge is simply letting them finish digging their own hole." And then we walked up, the 7-year-old Q5 a silent, unassuming weapon parked behind us, ready for the moment Julian, not I, would deliver the single, quiet statement that would collapse Madison's entire reality. I had provided the money for the gun, but Julian had chosen the exact, perfect moment to pull the intellectual trigger. The moment Julian delivered his line, that cold, precise question about registering our 2 cars at the mansion next door, was not a dramatic climax in the typical sense. There was no shouting, no crashing music. It was a silent, geometric collapse, the point at which 2 parallel lines of reality suddenly and violently intersected. I watched Madison and Chloe process the words. Lawyers are taught to look for the tiny, involuntary micro-expressions that betray a lie or a sudden shift in control. Chloe's first reaction was pure, animalistic fear, a twitch in her jaw, her eyes dilating as the value of her own leased SUV suddenly plummeted to zero. Madison, however, was more complex. Her terror was intellectual. She didn't fear the money, she feared the loss of her narrative. For years, her story depended on me being stable but pedestrian, rich enough to support her but not rich enough to compete with her superficial standards. The owner of the mansion next door was a myth, a pedestal of wealth too grand to be practical. To discover that the myth was me, the woman she'd just publicly pitied for driving an older Audi, meant her entire structure of superiority was a lie built on a foundation of my silent, deliberate deception. "You're joking," Madison finally managed, her voice thin and desperate. She looked around frantically, searching for the hidden camera, the punchline that would restore her control. "That house was purchased by a tech giant. It was an off-market deal. You would have told me." "Why would I have told you?" I asked, meeting her gaze steadily. My voice was low, and it carried the crushing weight of every unspoken truth from the past decade. It was the only line I would deliver in this entire exchange. It was enough. It was the precise counter-question that revoked her sisterly privilege. Why would I share my greatest achievement with a person who consistently mocked my competence? She had no answer. Her facade crumbled entirely. The charm, the effortless glamour, the practiced pity, it dissolved, revealing the naked, grasping insecurity beneath. Julian stepped back out onto the porch, carrying 2 glasses of ice water, completely unhurried. He handed one to me. He then looked at the two women who were still trying to make sense of the new world order. The closing was complicated, lots of trusts and holding entities, Julian explained, the picture of professional nonchalance. Emery handled the entire legal side for the purchase. The only reason we kept it quiet was privacy, mostly for me, but it seems to have had the unintended effect of confusing the neighbors. He paused, looking pointedly at Chloe's champagne flute. Enjoy the rest of your evening, Madison. Emery and I have a quick walk through with the landscapers across the way. He nodded once, dismissing them. He had made it clear, I wasn't just the wife of the tech giant, I was the architect of the acquisition. My boring legal career was, in fact, the weapon that had secured the ultimate prize. I took a slow sip of my water. I felt the profound, chilling peace of karmic justice. I didn't need to argue about the Q5. The Q5 was now the ultimate flex, proof that I owned the mansion and still didn't require external validation from a status symbol. Madison finally found a new emotional gear, anger. Not at me, but at the situation, at the unfairness of her own exposure. You let me do that, she accused, her voice shaking. You stood there and let Chloe insult you. You kept this a secret just to make me look bad. I looked at her, and the absence of emotion in my eyes was the sharpest blade I possessed. I let you be you, Madison, I corrected, my tone utterly devoid of heat. For years, I told myself that accepting your insults was the price of having a sister. I rationalized your endless demands as support. Tonight, you felt comfortable enough to publicly humiliate me in front of my fiancé for a choice I made about a completely debt-free asset. You didn't need me to set you up. You were already standing on the edge of the cliff, and all Julian did was ask an inconvenient question. Chloe took a staggered step backward. She understood. Her friendship with Madison was transactional, based on shared status updates and mutual catty judgment. If Madison was now proven to be the most tragically deluded person in the room, a person who openly insulted her own sister, the millionaire attorney who owned the $20 million compound next door, that friendship was instantly worthless. Julian gently touched my back, a signal to move. We turned, walking down the steps, leaving them stranded in the harsh, bright spotlight of the porch. As we reached the Audi Q5, I hit the key fob. The mundane beep echoed loudly in the silent, expensive street. Julian opened my door. Before I got in, I glanced back at Madison. She was standing perfectly still, her hand pressed against the granite pillar of my smaller house, her eyes glued to the dark, imposing structure next door. She wasn't looking at the building, she was looking at the life she had just permanently exiled herself from. I did not offer an explanation, an olive branch, or a final, victorious statement. I just got into my old, sensible car. The game was definitively over, won by silence and superior logistics. Julian slid into the driver's seat, and we pulled out of the driveway, the Q5 turning left, toward the wrought iron gates of the mansion. The ultimate, wordless betrayal of her expectations was complete. Pulling the Audi into the cavernous, climate-controlled garage of the new house felt less like an arrival and more like a final exhale. The granite driveway of the mansion was pristine, sweeping, and utterly silent. It was a space designed for consequence, not conflict. I didn't speak for a full minute after the engine shut off. The only sound was the low, electric hum of the garage systems. Julian respected the silence, understanding that the greatest emotional violence is the quiet processing of betrayal. They're still out there, he finally said, leaning back in his seat. They are, I confirmed. They'll be working through the stages of grief, disbelief, anger, and finally, the horrible, sinking knowledge of what they've lost. What Madison had lost wasn't just my financial support, which was substantial, it was the control. She had lost the ability to define me, to make my life about her emotional needs. The mansion was merely the physical manifestation of the reality I had shielded from her. I had allowed her to believe she was the elegant swan and I was the dutiful toad. When the toes pulled out the title deed to the adjacent lake, her delusion became indefensible. We went inside. I didn't feel triumph, only the cold, steady satisfaction of professional closure. This wasn't revenge in the dramatic sense, It was the intellectual fulfillment of a case where the evidence finally and unequivocally convicted the defendant. The consequences began immediately, delivered through the only channel Madison truly monitored, the digital realm. Within 30 minutes, my phone vibrated repeatedly. It was Madison. First, a series of frantic, spiraling texts. Emery, call me. We need to talk. This isn't fair. Is this because of Chloe? I'll tell her to apologize, I swear. Then, the inevitable slide into calculated damage control. Seriously, this is our house now, too, right? Can we tell people? It'll look great for my brand. I muted the thread. I knew the final stage would be the attempt to reclaim the connection through guilt. She would try to leverage our shared history, the years of siblinghood, to re-establish her dependency. The next communication was a voicemail. Her voice was thick, not with sorrow, but with the specific, awful sound of vanity wounded by reality. Emery, I'm scared. I don't know how I'm going to pay for the remodel now. I was relying on the next wire transfer, you know I was. You can't just cut me off. I'm your sister. We have history. Don't do this to me. Please, I need you. I'm the only family you have left that truly understands you. The final sentence was the only part I truly absorbed. I'm the only family you have left that truly understands you. It was the last, desperate lie. Julian understood me. My professional success understood me. Madison only understood the wallet she could access. I deleted the voicemail, unread except for the transcription preview. Silence. That was the key. She expected an argument, a declaration of independence, a triumphant I win. She was prepared for a fight, because a fight would mean I was still emotionally invested. My refusal to engage, my complete, utter, professional silence, forced her to confront the consequence without the comforting distraction of a dramatic showdown. The following morning, I took the day off. Julian and I sat on the patio, drinking coffee while the landscapers began work on the massive infinity pool complex. From our vantage point, we could see my old house, the one I had just abandoned. I opened my laptop and methodically performed 3 tasks. Called my bank, I ensured all joint accounts, which were minimal, thankfully, were dissolved and that the standing order for her emergency fund was permanently cancelled. Called my former assistant, I directed her to handle the notification to Madison's landlord that I would no longer be acting as a secondary guarantor on her lease, effective 30 days. The notification was brief, factual, and delivered by my legal team, not by me. Changed the security codes. I remotely revoked all of Madison's access codes to the smaller house, effectively closing the last physical bridge between our lives. Julian watched me, calm and supportive. No regrets? He asked softly. Regret is a luxury, I replied, closing the laptop. It implies I could have chosen a different outcome without sacrificing my self-respect. I didn't cut her off for money, Julian. I cut her off for the lie. She made her final choice to humiliate me over a 7-year-old car, thinking my value was only what I lacked. She showed me who she was, and I believed her. The drop was not a crash, but a slow, quiet fade into irrelevance. Madison's fate was now entirely her own problem. I didn't need to watch the rest of the play unfold. I had paid my dues to our shared past. Now, my future demanded silence. I had given her a mirror, and she was now, finally, forced to look into it alone. The quiet justice was absolute. The vastness of the new home was not measured in square footage, but in the distance it placed between me and my past obligations. 200 yards separated the paid-off, respectable dwelling, the one Madison had felt entitled to mock, from this fortress of glass and privacy. That physical distance was insignificant compared to the emotional chasm I had finally built. Julian and I spent the evening on the upper terrace, overlooking the lights of the city. My old house was visible, a small, dark shape in the sprawl, and next to it, I imagined Madison still lingering, trying to rationalize what had happened. She would be calling Chloe, constructing a revised narrative where I was the villain, the cold-hearted attorney who held out on her family. But even Madison, skilled as she was at self-deception, would struggle with the facts. She had laughed at the car, and in response, I had bought the entire street. The choice of silence, the total refusal to engage, was the definitive execution of my freedom. Madison expected the screaming match, the dramatic confrontation, because that was her currency. Conflict gave her a chance to play the victim, to weaponize guilt. My silence was a vacuum. It gave her nothing to push against, forcing her to bear the full weight of her own actions. The revenge was simply allowing the consequence to exist, unmitigated by my customary effort to soothe, explain, or forgive. In the hours that followed the exposure, I felt an extraordinary stillness. Not happiness, which is volatile, but resolution, which is absolute. Forgiveness implies that the trespasser repents and that the wounded party must choose to carry the pain or release it. I did neither. Madison hadn't trespassed, she had executed a contract of emotional exploitation, one I had foolishly renewed every time I mistook her dependence for sisterly love. When the terms were irrevocably broken, I simply terminated the agreement and walked away. There was nothing to forgive, only a broken relationship to file under forensic closure. The money, the property, the quiet power Julian and I possessed, these were merely the tools that enabled the true victory. The real prize was the reclaiming of my emotional space. The older Audi Q5 was not a symbol of my frugality, it was a symbol of my autonomy. I drove it because I could, not because I had to. Madison's life was an endless, desperate chase for the next status marker to prove her worth. My life was defined by the things I no longer needed to prove to anyone. I thought about the future. There would be no dramatic reconciliation at a family holiday. There would be no tearful phone call where Madison genuinely apologized and promised to change. Those moments belonged to melodramas and sentimentality, and I had exited that genre forever. My duty now was strictly to myself. To Julian, who had provided the anchor and the perfect, quiet catalyst for my rebirth. I had spent decades as the responsible sister, pouring my emotional and financial resources into a vessel that only knew how to leak. Now, I was the vessel, and I was full, intact, and moving under my own direction. The sun rose over the mansion, catching the reflective glass walls that shielded us from the world. It was a beautiful, stark, unyielding structure, a physical reflection of the person I had become, successful, quiet, and finally, impenetrable. I looked down at the old house one last time, observing the spot where the Audi had been parked just 12 hours prior. I realized that the greatest difference between my sister and me was not wealth, but knowledge. She knew what she wanted to acquire, I knew what I was prepared to lose. And by being willing to lose the illusion of her approval, I had acquired everything. The silence was the final word. It was the absolute, unanswerable period at the end of the sentence. And it was mine, forever.